Hi everyone, I will jump straight in. I'm presenting to you today on behalf of the OpenSFS Lustre Working Group. So this is a forum for discussion of any activities relating to the Lustre community releases. It's been operating for about a decade. Presently myself and Dustin Leatherman are the leads, and this URL here you'll find information about contact details and how to join the calls, mailing lists, etc. So one of the activities we're involved in is the annual Lustre survey, which goes out to try and gather information about Lustre usage today and people's planned Lustre usage in the future, and with a view here to sort of gather some data to help with our decision making around priorities for the release. So you can see here, this graphic here, I've got the historic data. You can see it's fairly consistent, some fluctuations year to year. We have seen the last 2 years a little on the lower side, but still statistically significant to do comparison purposes. So we normalize the results by percentages just to sort of do a more like-to-like comparison about trends over time. So the full detailed historic data are on this URL here, if you're interested. And I did also provide a detailed summary of this year's data in my presentation at LUG this year, but right now I'm just going to focus specifically on the version output. So you can see here we have the last 3 years data about Lustre versions in production. So these are 2019, 2020, and 2021, and you can see typically the trend is for that to decline over time as people move to newer versions, or perhaps older systems go out of service. The two ringed versions here, Lustre 2.10 and 2.12, are the exceptions, 2.10 being our former LTS branch and 2.12 being the present one. And you can see that there was strong coalescing around those releases and very strong adoption of 2.12, and 2.10 is still a fairly strong performance, but is gradually starting to reduce here over time. Now, this, of course, looking at this data and how well people are sticking to the LTS releases as a whole, usually draws the question, which release will be the next LTS branch? So this has been the subject of a lot of discussion over in the LWG, and I'll move on to talk about this in more detail. So this year we also had a question on the survey about this as well. Drilling into the details here, it was clear that there were a split of opinions, which is not altogether surprising. Generally there's a spectrum of people's openness to risk or wanting to adopt new features versus just have a known, well-proven quantity. So broadly, the initial survey, which is this pie chart here, was fairly split down the middle as to whether people wanted to move to the then just come out 2.14 release versus to hold off for at least a year. Again, there was some differing views in the LWG forum about this. Generally, there's people who were keen to adopt new features or had particular interest in newer hardware that required newer kernels for their storage servers, so they were keen to see a stream of maintenance releases coming out on a version that would work for. And on the other hand, there's people who were always disinclined to move too quickly to a newer version and would rather stay and have production stability. And that was compounded by some recent changes announced for CentOS. Subsequently, Andreas and myself gave a Lustre presentation there, so we did a survey there. It was relatively small participation, but favoring sort of remaining on 2.12 was the outcome. At LUG, that was a stronger participation in terms of numbers, and again, remaining on 2.12 was the most common option, but there was still strong for varying other moves at other future times. And ISC, smaller than you might have expected participation from that in terms of the survey, but that was actually came out the other way and was strongly suggesting we should move to 2.14 at the time. So all told, sort of trying to make some sense of this, giving it a lot of thought, had a lot of discussions, and our recommendation is to designate Lustre 2.15 as the next LTS branch. So 2.15 is not out yet, but is targeted for the end of the year. Although there was some sort of small interest in sort of maybe people who are using CentOS today, some of them were looking at moving to Ubuntu. The overwhelming majority were either going to move to Red Hat or one of the Red Hat derivatives like Alma Linux or Rocky. So we think the best thing to do is to continue to make the primary kernel that we focus much of our testing on to be Red Hat 8 or derivatives, and that still people who have interest in other options like Ubuntu servers, those are kept up to date in the tree, and people will find similar levels of support that they've had on current versions. So announcing this ahead of time allows time for more testing to happen ahead of the release itself going out in the first place. So the initial .0 release should be better quality, and it also allows time for us to work out, how to incorporate Alma and or Rocky into our regular testing, just as we do with CentOS today. Of course, there will be some people who are voting for the staying put who may be dismayed at this, so I will explain why I don't believe they should be too concerned, because if we do the same as with 2.10 and 2.12 and give a 6-month overlap, we'll see with the time it takes to get 2.15 out in the first place, and that we still could potentially be doing 2.12 maintenance releases for at least another year. And then even if you don't want to move from 2.12, you can leverage the interop capabilities between the LTS versions, and so you could keep on your 2.12 whatever servers and maybe use 2.15.2 clients if you're looking to get support for a newer Red Hat version that isn't going to be provided by a release coming out on the 2.12 branch. And of course, this is open source, and so you have freedom. There will be some people who will just want to keep going on 2.12. Of course, 2.12 has been out a while, is stable, and there's not a lot of bug fixes. So the work that would need to be done to, support a new version of Mofed or a new minor Red Hat release is likely to be fairly minimal, and will just be a question of cherry picking something that's gone into master or the 2.15 branch. And so those details can be passed around and people can still take advantage of that. And then finally, this is just a recommendation, and so I wouldn't say this decision is set in stone. If people who haven't to date engaged in this discussion process would like to, and to sort of tell us why this is not the right approach, then please do so, and the LWG is the best way to do that. So moving on to more routine business, 2.12 LTS releases. So we had 2.12.7 went out in July in response to the RHEL 8.4 release, and we would expect a 2.12.8 release towards the end of the year whenever a RHEL 8.5 release is available. Moving on to 14 was our last major release, so that went GA in February. So as you saw earlier on, that was very close to the time of the survey going out, so we didn't have much adoption of people using the release at that time, but subsequently there has been some adoption of this release, and it had a few useful features. Particularly, I think the client-side data encryption was one that I've heard interest in, and some further improvements around D&E usability as well are much welcome. Going into a bit more detail on 2.14, I've had some interest in these contribution charts I've had for some years, just to sort of see the people who contribute code to the release. This data is actually drawn from Git with a script, and thanks to Dustin Leverman Oak Ridge for producing it, the data raw data for me. So I will call out here, I always like to spotlight for LAD contributions from Europe. So CA, of course, our host for this event, among those. And also, it may not be obvious, but we had our first contribution from Google, and that was actually from an engineer based in Europe as well. So good to see Google joining the community there, and look forward to more from them in the future. And you can see these graphs here on the right show how the amount of change in the releases in terms of lines of code and commits, number of commits has varied over the years, and also the number of different organizations and developers who've been involved in in all the various releases. Moving on to 2.15, so this is the major release that we're working on at the moment. This has gone into feature freeze, so we're really busy just with testing and bug fixing at the moment. Like I said, with the announcement that this is expected to become the next LTS release, it would be really great for people to get involved and get testing with builds from master now, and to sort of make sure that we can make this the best release it can be. In terms of features that went in, the one calling out the ones that are on the community roadmap, there's some further encryption work. So the 2.14 release had the contents of the files being encrypted, and now in 2.15 there's also the file names themselves can be encrypted. So if there's any sensitive information, perhaps in, say, like medical files or something, that could not be seen by anyone other than the people who have the need to see that information. GPU Direct, so that's using the NVIDIA GPU Direct capability, and also network selection policy. This is actually a feature that's been talked about for a very long time, as you can probably tell from this rather old Jira reference here. I think Amir presented about this at LUG 2018. This finally got merged now, and this basically is an extension of multi-rail LNet that allows you to sort of specify preferences around network usage. For example, if you had a fast network and a slower network, you could specify to prioritize using the fast network and just use the slower network in the event that the fast network was down. Just to show the timings overall, this is the roadmap that's shown on Lustre.org at the moment, and some of these contents here Andrea Stilgo will be talking about in more detail tomorrow. And so just to sort of recap, the discussions have been going on about timing for switching the LTS branch. We're now leaning towards 2.15. The 2.12.8 release will likely come towards the end of the year. 2.15 is in release testing at the moment, and your participation in testing it would be most welcome. And more generally, there's no shortage of things to do if people are interested in getting involved in Lustre development. And finally, to once again plug the Lustre Working Group for anyone who's interested in finding more out about that. Okay, thank you very much.